I had a little epiphany watching the Lake Okeechobee Bassmaster Elite Series, and there were some big bags, right? Not a lot of them, but there were some monster bags, and especially watching Brandon Palaniuk, dude. Absolutely insane. And ironically, it reminded me a whole bunch of a technique that we have talked about a whole bunch. Using like a jerkbait or a flat-sided style kind of crankbait, like a finesse style crankbait, to actually make these fish react. You know, instead of twitching it, instead of kind of like slow rolling it, we're kind of blazing it a little, moving it quick, causing these fish to react that we're seeing on forward-facing sonar that are like kind of suspended or using ditches and things like that. And I sort of just had this sort of come to Jesus moment. I'm like, huh, I think there's like 5 baits that you have to have on your deck that are gonna win 80% of tournaments. There's gonna always be exceptions, there's no doubt about it, and you guys can argue with me down in the comments box if you want. But I think there's 5 basic setups that are winning 80% of derbies when it comes to it in the past like 2 years. And I don't think it's gonna change for the next 365 days of the year. So hit that like and subscribe button. I'm gonna run through it. Like I said, you guys can argue with me, but I'm pretty sure I'm on point with this. So what are the 5 setups or the 5 lures that we're talking about? And let me go through the exception right off the bat before everybody gets all riled up in that. There's been like 4 major tournaments down here in Florida in the past like month and a half or so. An Invitational in Kissimmee, the Harris Chain BPT, Lake Okeechobee Bassmaster Elite, and the MLF Toyota Series. 2 of those tournaments, not totally, but almost totally, have been about spawning and staging fish. Fish up in the pads like you see around behind me, up in the grass, up in the cane, the emergent vegetation. And those fish are spawning, right? So worms, chatterbaits, popping frogs, walking frogs. You know, your classic shallow water baits, that's gonna be the exception to this rule. If these fish are shallow, they're moved up, they're spawning, they're staging, that's the exception. But the other 2 tournaments, once again, in Florida, dude, the land of grass, the land of swamp fishing, have been practically won on forward-facing sonar. And using setups that, I don't care if you're on Gunnersville, Pickwick, if you're up north, if you're down here in Florida, the land of swamps, it just seems to continue to work. And that's been the sort of the, I don't know, the standard the past like 2 years. And they're real simple setups. You can use variations on them to kind of tweak them to your area. But the first one, and this one we'll talk about because of Brandon Palaniuk and because we've talked about it so much, it's using some kind of hard reaction bait. I really like to use like a jerk bait. Like this is a Bass Mafia right here. This is the shot caller, but a mega bass, a stunner, your flat-sided crankbaits like the Fritz side. Obviously there's gonna be that new mega bass that Brandon Palaniuk was using, a shad wrap, you know, like these sort of like finesse style crankbaits, whether they're shallow runners, kind of mid runners, things along those lines, whatever you wanna do, but you're not actually hitting bottom with them. And you're using a different retrieve. Instead of using like a twitch motion or kind of like, you know, pop, 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 pause kind of deal, using different cadences, you're using it to make them react. You're actually reeling, and then like we like to do, and like I've kind of told you about, is power reeling, you know, 3-4 quick reels, pause, 3-4 quick reels, pause, or just increasing your speed as a fish gets behind it. These crankbaits are perfect. They've always made fish react, but we can use them in sort of a different variation where we're actually using them to either draw fish up from the bottom from a ditch, things along those lines, or like Brandon was doing, where there's fish floating, kind of suspended a little down in the water column, you're staying above them and you're just kind of power fishing over them and drawing them up and drawing them to close the deal. So that's one. A jerkbait slash kind of a power fishing crankbait that stays higher in the water column to draw fish up and that you can fish fast. You can burn it, you can fish it slow, but most of the time you're gonna fish it at a pretty good pace, maybe use some pauses, but you're gonna cause those fish to react and you're able to speed it up to actually close the deal. The other one, super obvious, right? And that's a minnow style bait. You know, that forward facing, mid strolling, whatever you want to call it, hover strolling, just this is like a little zoom, kind of winged fluke with my little rocker head. But the key here being is a smaller minnow bait, like a 2-inch, 2.5-inch, 3-inch, maybe 4-inch. So something on the smaller side of those minnow baits. I've really found that fish are either keyed in on something small or you have to make them look at it, which is gonna lead to our next selection. But having that small bait, even if the bait isn't small, it just seems to be 90% of the time they want that little compact deal and they gravitate towards it. Now there's exceptions. It's just like kind of like glide bait fishing. Sometimes these fish are neutral, they're not reacting, they're not doing what they should be doing, and they're not closing. Sometimes you got to go up to the big dong. And that thing has been magic, whether it's the Sakamata shad like this, the 7-inch or the 8-inch, or my buddy Ryan from Cast Baits, he actually threw me a couple prototypes of the new Echo, which is I think a 7-inch bait. Giant fluke style minnow baits. And it's not even because the fish are eating baits that big. Sometimes that's the case. Obviously in Florida, there's giant brim, there's big gizzard shad actually, which people don't know about, big shiners, things like that. But it's about that drawing aspect. A lot of the glide bait guys who are really good always talk about it. They'll be like, never go smaller on a glide bait, only go bigger. And it's that drawing power. And it might not even close the deal, but for some reason, it's the curiosity of the fish, the aggressiveness of the fish. The bigger the bait you go, the more they're drawn in and just sort of intrigued by it, and maybe even intimidated, or it causes them to get aggressive and trigger. But having that big bait, even if your bait, your forage is small, is a huge component. So having a giant minnow, like a 7-inch, an 8-inch, a big mondo, as I like to call them, dong minnow, long dong silver. So the other thing, and this is where you can get some variations, but I've caught so many fish in the past, even before forward facing, on this little guy, a little Kitech. Now, whether that's a 3.3, a 2.8, or something a little bit bigger, like a line through, you know, like a Bass Mafia. This is the loaded swim bait. This is like a 6-inch. But some kind of swim bait that you're able to do a couple different things with. One, slow roll near to the bottom or just above the bottom to draw fish up, or to fish structure that's near the bottom, whether it's hard spots, whether it's a brush pile, stumps, things along those lines, even grass. Or you want it to be high, like high up in that water column, and there's something about that kicking boot versus your dangle minnow that's just kind of rocking back and forth and twitching. There's something about that swimming action that's a different profile, a different vibration. It's just a different feel for those fish, whether it has to do with their lateral line or their aggression level. It has a different kind of signature to them, and it draws a different type of reaction. All these baits that I'm showing you are all sort of geared towards getting different kinds of reactions, triggering the fish in different ways, and they cover different areas of that. Whether it's the big draw of that big swim bait, whether it's finesse, moving it quick, you know, with the hard bait, getting them to react. They're sort of all different little nuanced ways to present to get these fish to trigger, follow, and then close the deal. Now, there are exceptions, right? There's a few variations. Those are my basic 5, and to be honest with you, they cover you whether you're fishing 5, 6, 7 feet of water over grass, whether it's open water, grass, stump, whatever, all the way out to deep. Like, that's the crazy part. Literally, dude, these fish can be up shallow, medium depths, or they can be way out deep, like total pre-spawn wintering fish, and these baits will work when you vary your jig head weights, etc. The exception, or the sort of one variation, is something that I always like to have with me, and that's big glide baits. So there's some drawing power and some closing power to big glide baits that practically can't be duplicated with any other lure. And I'm not going crazy big, like 10, 11, 12 inches, but I got an array of, like, you know, there's Tato baits in there, there's Chad Shads, there's Bait Sanity, I got a KGB in there. I have a range of kind of like your 7, 6.5, 8-inch, 9-inch glide style baits that I can then modify to, once again, vary my depth presentations, whether I want to get them down, sink them down to like 20 foot, whether I want to, you know, fish them shallow and just chop glide them up like in 4 or 5 foot over the grass. And there's a lot of ways to modify it to fish in different water columns, but that drawing power is something that, even though a lot more guys are throwing them, it's something that kind of is that wild card, especially if you get the right conditions, that you need to have if you're going to do some of this forward-facing kind of tournament-winning techniques. That's my array, though, and it just seems to be proven tournament after tournament. The only exception being is when you get these spawn staging tournaments that kick in. That's when you see, you know, your standard, you know, worms, your chatterbaits, guys throwing spinner baits, frogs, things along those lines, because these fish get so shallow that you really can't target them, or they're in such thick cover, you can't target them with forward facing. I will tell you this though, I've caught forward facing fish as shallow as 3 foot. I'm not minnow dangling them that shallow, but what I'm doing is using it to understand, like say you got a point, right? And the point sticks out, it's supposed to be at the tip of the point, right? You'd think you make a bunch of casts, you don't catch any fish. I'll actually go around that shallow point and look on the sides of it and see, oh, there's a line of like 5 fish on the side of that clay point. They're not on the tip, they're on the side. I need to make my cast with that trap or whatever I'm using on that side of the point. So I've actually caught them not specifically dangling to each specific fish, but using it to catch them ultra shallow on that forward facing. It's kind of a sneaky technique that not a lot of guys are really talking about yet. But with those exceptions aside, it seems like 80% of the tournaments, and especially if you're winning tournaments in Florida, using these styles of techniques but varying them for depth, you can't argue with the results. And to be honest with you too, I love tournament fishing, but at the same time, I'm not just gonna like commit to those baits because it gets boring, right? Like I like throwing a chatterbait, I like throwing a frog, I like figuring out like weird things that I can do. So understanding what wins and understanding what you wanna do and what you wanna play with, they're two different things, but I think it's important to recognize, and especially for making your rod selection and your bait selection pretty efficient, it's important to recognize what's being successful, what guys are winning on, and how you kind of duplicate that and become effective with those techniques so you can be successful as well. Feel free to argue with me. I love disagreement. I love sort of, the discourse that we get into, because you guys have a ton of experience when it comes to fishing, probably more experience than me when it comes to fishing tournaments. So I like to kind of get your feedback. Drop what you think down in the comments box. Did I miss one? Am I way off base? Like, I don't think I am. And especially when guys are doing this in Florida, it's hard to argue with the fact that these types of baits, these 5 styles of baits, don't win tournaments in any state on practically any body of water. But hit that like and subscribe button for me. Once again, thank you guys for the 100K. I would have never gotten there without you. But make sure you hit that notifications button. I got some sick big bass videos coming to you from Florida, and I think you guys will enjoy them. I'm gonna give Bog a pat for you. We will see you later. Peace out, boys.